Welcome to our first in our ethics series discussing artificial intelligence. I'm very excited to talk about this with you all today. First, just a little bit about me. If you don't know me, I am a clinical psychologist and I'm the assessment and testing program director here at UCBT. And I've done some ethics trainings with y'all before. We have a good time. We're going to have a good time today. And always interested in using that ethical lens or looking at the evidence base for sort of what the hot topic is in our field or what we're coming across in all of our clinical work. And I would say casual AI user, but have really delved into the research and some training in this for y'all today and for our talk. We just some like quick disclosures, no commercial support, conflicts of interest, and minimal risk. We are discussing professional ethics primarily through the codes with the American Psychological Association and the National Association for Social Work. I have reviewed the codes in the past for clinical mental health counselors and marriage and family therapists, and they're all very aligned. But still, yes, be mindful of your own professional ethical codes and then state laws as well. If in case you didn't see it, the Utah Psychological Association just released some comprehensive guidelines related to AI in professional practice. So I'll reference that a little bit in here as well, but I highly recommend checking that out. It's a pretty substantial guide. And yeah, even if you're not practicing in Utah, I think it gives some good insights. And just a note that research and skills discussed here might not apply or be appropriate for all populations. So we'll try to note those limitations as they come up. And then, of course, on theme, very meta, disclosure and the use of AI, generative AI content. So for demonstration purposes, there has been some things to show you guys as examples, but they will be explicitly noted and are a very minimal part of the content of this presentation. I came up with a title by myself and everything. So our learning objectives today, we're really starting this part one as an overview. So we're going to talk about AI in general and how it's kind of being used in the mental health space or some potential uses that are being explored. We're going to look at the updated ethical guidelines that the APA came out that explicitly talk about AI, but also referencing other ethical codes that they more so address technology in general, but how that could be applied to AI as well. And we're looking specifically about the issues that connect to privacy, transparency, and equity, because that seems to be where the most, I guess, dilemmas show up or potential dilemmas show up. So we're going to break that down a little bit more. Look at, what are the facts? What do the research say in terms of like all these potential concerns or ethical implications? What are still the unanswered questions? What are some benefits? But this presentation is, as I said, a part one. So in a couple weeks, we have Dr. Ertl. He's going to be talking to you more about ethical decision making and using specific AI tools and tech in clinical or administrative work and dive into that a bit deeper and weighing some of those different elements. We know there's lots of ethical decision-making models, so he's going to be diving deeper with y'all about that. And then for part three, we have Dr. Applewhite, who currently is a part of, does some consultation work for an AI-powered mental health support app. And so through her work with that, she's going to be talking to more of the larger question of like, what is a therapist's ethical responsibility or role in getting involved with mental health AI development. So both of those should be pretty cool. So if you haven't registered for the whole series, I highly recommend it. Checking those out. Hope to see you there. So as I said before, we're going to just start by looking at foundations more broadly before diving into like those three main ethics categories. But first, I would love to hear from you guys. There are opportunities during this talk where I'm going to ask you to share some comments in the chat just about your experiences, or I'm going to pose some ethical questions to you. So it's all chat based. You don't have to, don't worry, you don't have to get on camera. I know it's hard if you're not prepared to do that or you don't have to talk. But yes, in the chat, I would love to hear how, if at all, you guys use AI in your role, and um, is it more for administrative task? Is there clinical use happening? Like, I kind of just want to get the pulse of the audience today of like, what is some of your experience? So you could put it in the chat or in the FAQs. Um, and give some space there. But just, yeah, what is sort of your role with that? Seeing some different feedback. Some people haven't used it at all due to the environmental impact. We will talk about that for sure, because that is definitely a question I have as well. Some people are saying they are unsure how to use it effectively or need to better understand it. Some have used it to like create some ideas for exposures in sessions. Some that have been HIPAA compliant, more for some that are more for administrative tasks. Some they don't use it, but their clients do and share some feedback. So yeah, definitely a wide range, finding resources for clients. Um, yeah, and then there's some questions. So yeah, also I should mention that if you have questions at any time, do try to use the FAQ for the questions. Like we do have Jen here monitoring the chat just in case, and she'll let me know as questions come up. But yeah, thanks for giving some feedback on that. Yeah, quite a wide range of where people are at with it. I would say I'm similar to the folks that are like, might use it for some references or like to know what's out there, or but not super integrated is kind of where I'm at. And yeah, definitely have some questions about the environmental impact and where that data is going. And those are questions that I will be addressing today. So thank you for sharing your background in that. Okay, now that we kind of get a sense of where everyone is at, let's dig into some basic definitions. We always got to start with definitions. I don't know if that's just the psychologist in me needing to like operationally define everything, but like we got to be on the same page about what even we're talking about. So the title of the talk that I'm giving today is that It's Happening Whether We Wanted to or Not, comes from Dr. Jackson, who was quoted in an article from APA Monitor on Psychology. And I thought it really encapsulated like where we're at with it. But the full quote is that a lot of people get resistant, but this is something we can't control. It's happening whether we want it to or not. If we're thoughtful and strategic about how we integrate AI, we can have a real impact on lives around the world. Isn't that a fun little inspiration. So what that article was really diving into was how psychologists in particular, but also I think applicable to mental health professionals, um, have an opportunity to better research how this is going to affect people, to hold up the ethical side of, our clients' well-being, to ask questions and maybe be skeptical, and really kind of dig into what is evidence-based around this. And so it makes sense why we participate in this, or that we could be helpful in participating in this, um, especially when it comes to advocating for groups that may be underrepresented in the development of technology and tools and how it's being used. And so we'll get more into that when we talk about the different ethics, but I thought that was like a nice overview. And but first, I just want to pose the question. You don't have to answer this, or you can in your head. What is AI? Like I was like, if you had to define it, could you define it? Like we might kind of know-ish what it refers to. And I was almost having the thought the other day that I was like, oh, like it's kind of, we'll know it when we see it, but actually that's not true. It's specifically not true. We might not know it when we see it. So how do you know? So I thought it would be helpful if we really just explicitly was like, what are we talking about when we talk about AI or artificial intelligence? And surprise, surprise, there's really not a consensus per anything in the scientific field about what it is, just because of the kind of amorphous and constantly developing nature of AI. So the definitions that I'm using are coming from the definitions used by the federal government when they were developing guidelines and executive orders around artificial intelligence. So that's kind of where I got these specific definitions from. But in industry, they might be slightly different. But most agree that AI refers to computer systems that can perform complex tasks typically done by human intelligence or that mimic human intelligence. And these would include things like learning, decision making, predicting. I put behaviors in quotations because I was like, do you call it a behavior if it's a machine? I don't know. But so that's kind of what it is. AI is computers or systems or networks acting as if they are human cognition broadly. Some more specifics include when any system does tasks under varying or unpredictable circumstances, somewhat independently, but most importantly, that they learn from this experience and can incorporate new data and change how they're operating. So there is this like dynamic process that happens, and there's learning in some capacity that happens. It requires things like perception, cognition, planning, learning, communication, action. It's thinking or acting like a human. It approximates a cognitive task. There could be an intelligent agent or embodied robot that achieves these different goals. So it might be even to the point where there's an actual thing that's looking like it's responsible for doing these things. So these are the systems we're referring to when it comes to AI, and they're pretty overlapping, but sometimes distinct. And I thought it would also be helpful to talk about different terms you might hear when exposed to AI or when people talk about it. So one is machine learning. Now, machine learning might sound familiar just because that's been around for a very long time. And usually in the context of like large research data sets. Like I remember machine learning when I was in grad school. I won't say how long ago, but so it's like that has kind of always existed to some extent, like algorithmic data. that don't require explicit human input. So some examples you might see in your life include like your social media feeds. So, it's a big deal, but when they like moved Instagram to just be like more recent, to just like they're pushing you things based on your behaviors. Deep learning is a type of machine learning that is a little bit more complex and has to process a lot of unstructured data. So it's a little bit more sophisticated. So these would be the things powering our self-driving cars and our chatbots. And then we have generative AI, which is the creation of new content based on learned patterns from existing data. And we have learned language model or LLMs that use these massive data sets of text and code, and it generates human-like interactions via text, like our Chat GPT, our Gemini, our Claudes, that those are the ones probably people are most familiar with. So a learned language model is a type of generative AI. Generative AI can also do images and videos, so that's why we kind of separate out the language. Generative AI learned language model also uses deep learning. Deep learning is a type of machine learning. So these aren't all necessarily like separate AI processes. They all kind of interact or are part of each other, but these are very common terms that you might hear. So I also thought it would be helpful to dig a bit into what people are doing in the field, not necessarily like the average clinician, although sometimes that happens, or sometimes clients, sometimes clinicians, but more so what's being developed and studied for research and what has potential for clinical applications as well. So there's a lot of research going on right now where people are trying to gather these data sets to determine like diagnosis. Like, can it better just like take all of this data and help, decide does a person have this or this, or predict potential risk behaviors. There's also more of our administrative type things like summarizing sessions, writing notes. There's more like recommendations to better support treatment planning. There's a ton of other research applications that I won't get into. And then for the client side of things, there's our chatbots for therapy support, some that are not specifically trained for therapy and some that are. And I would say that like for most of these applications, I was just sort of struck by like what most of the research is talking about and what all the articles are talking about are kind of the more exciting things like therapy bots or apps and clinical diagnosis and risk behaviors, which is all very cool. But I think what clinicians are probably most personally interested in are like, can it help me do my really mundane administrative tasks so I can focus on like the more like important parts of my job, or not necessarily not important, but like more interesting parts of my job. But I don't know if it's surprisingly or not surprisingly, there isn't as much research on that specifically. But is that in our part two, Alex is going to talk to you guys more about like that side of things. So some examples of what's in the research right now is using really large data sets to help diagnose dementia or alcoholism. And those two are standing out in particular because in order for AI models to work well like this with really complex data, they need a lot of data and a lot of like mental health type, either like diagnoses or interventions, don't have the like huge data sets that AI is typically used to working with. And so, like, dementia is an example of something that has a big data set or large data sets. Alcoholism has large data sets. So sometimes the applications is a bit limited by like what types of data are available, how much, and how much it's shared. There's some related to chart reviews for insurance claims. And then there's a lot of research using kind of like non-clinical data or heterogeneous data for clinical applications. So these would include things like, not including the clinical data, like with notes and medical records, but any wearables like fitness trackers that have like biometric data, social media behaviors, speech patterns, and texts to predict risk behaviors. So some, like for example, there's studies that are showing that through the analysis of people's Instagram photos, they can predict the risk of depression and suicide. Through analysis of speech, like text speech, they can predict prodromal development of psychosis. Through the integration of some genetic vulnerability data plus the environmental data, they can predict a person's risk for PTSD. So that is pretty cool, but it kind of also, well, I'll get into the concerns in a minute. But yeah, those would be cool if we have like really effective models of predicting those risks. And then we have our lovely therapy chatbots that I wanted to dig into a bit deeper because we're therapists here. So what I'm talking about right here are those that are specifically trained for mental health. There are people that are like using more open AI type frameworks for their mental health, even though they're not trained to do so, which has its own problems that we'll get into, but ones that are specifically developed for this purpose. Often they are embodied AI frameworks, meaning like there is some type of person-ish thing that is interacting with clients like they are talking directly to a therapist. And some initial efficacy studies are showing potentially positive results. It does reduce depression and anxiety. They specifically compared it to other resources, like electronic resources. So not, from what I could tell, any studies are comparing it to like current evidence-based treatments. They're just like, this is really highly niche in these like development spaces right now. Some are using what they call like avatar coaches to support schizophrenia in the sense that like there's like this avatar that shows up and the client's supposed to talk to them while they're having hallucinations, and the avatar can kind of support reality testing a little bit and that showing some promise. They have companion bots for people with dementia that are kind of in assisted living, and we know social isolation, social loneliness is kind of a risk factor for those folks, so they support quality of care there. And some bots or social coaches, robot coaches for social skills for kids with autism, finding that like autistic children might respond better to a robot than a person because a robot's way cooler at it, you know? So those are some of the current applications or recent applications that are being researched that, yeah, there's so many cool things that I could do, which is why it's hard to pin down like an exact definition. And yes, with all of those like cool potential things that are happening, there are some questions and concerns around it. So this is another audience participation. Some of you have shared your concerns before, like the environmental impact and where the data is going. But what are the concerns? What questions do you have or thoughts do you have about these applications in the mental health space? What would be helpful to go into what data there is and the ethical implications of this? Share your thoughts in the chat. Yeah. Risk behaviors, suicidality, homicidality, privacy, confidentiality, HIPAA, sensitive data, getting into a public learning model, hallucinations. We are going to talk about AI hallucinations and risk behaviors and HIPAA and confidentiality, addiction to technology versus human. Yep. You guys are thinking along the same lines that many other folks are thinking and writing about. How could clients do this more instead of seeing a clinician? Yeah. Will our jobs be replaced by AI? Clinicians might be overly reliant, yeah, on the tech. Yeah. Said you guys are kind of echoing what people are indeed concerned about. So, data privacy and security. We're going to get more of that in the privacy section, but that is a big one. So, I'll talk more about what we know about who uses or accesses data and what the parameters are. Bias is another big one we're going to dive deeper in, but yeah, in order for AI models to work, they have to be programmed, and they could be programmed with bias, or the data they could be used to train is biased, right? There's inaccuracies. It can create an over reliance on the tech for the clients and the clinicians, like the people using it. So we're not as honing in our skills and our cognitive abilities. The lack of human connection, for sure. Like just reflecting on this idea that like if our whole profession or treatment model is based on the relationship, what happens when you remove the humanness out of that relationship? Like there was an article that was discussing like how would an AI manage transference? Like would it have the ability to recognize like when someone is putting on those certain emotions and assumptions and relational, yeah, from like just like a process standpoint, or the crisis or risk piece, like how would it handle a mandated reporting situation? And if it did or didn't do that correctly, who's responsible? And then there's potential like very harmful interactions and outputs. So there is a phenomenon called hallucinations, and that is when generative AI either like asserts that not only asserts that something is true, but like makes up sources for it, like acts as if there are certain facts in place that are not, totally made them up and didn't say that it made them up, or misinterpreted facts out of context. And this kind of happens by maybe like the over reliance on patterns. And if there's any gaps, it just kind of fills in the gaps. Some, well, a very famous example of hallucination happened in the news related to Twitter's AI or X's AI. I won't go into that one. It was like highly aggressive and inappropriate. So you can look in the news if you want to read about that one. But there's another famous example of a hallucination that happened recently where a legal brief was filed by these lawyers and they used AI to make the brief, but it was flagged because one, the brief like referenced court cases that didn't actually exist, like made up cases for like precedent, and or it did like a fake quote even though it was a real case, like made up a quote that came from it, or maybe the case in the citation was correct but it did not interpret the legal argument from that case correctly. And so those lawyers were each fined like 3 grand by a judge for doing that. Like, no, I don't know if it was using AI, but just like not verifying the AI. So it definitely is not at this stage like invaluable. So we'll talk more about that in the context of our ethical topics about like how to mitigate that potential risk and what to do to keep an eye on that. But yeah, it hallucinates all the time. And yeah, the fear that our jobs will be replaced by AI bots. There is some data about that as well. Some people have done studies comparing like a human therapist response to an AI therapist response. And there's some interesting data in there that we'll talk about. But let's talk about the environment. A few of you have like shared that that was a concern. And I also feel like that's a concern. And there's not necessarily like a specific ethical code in our professional ethics that addresses like we have to be concerned about the environment. But I feel like the essence of this like do no harm, care about the well-being of people could translate to the planet and just for information so you can inform consent, make an informed decision about engaging in this. Here is what we know about the environmental impact right now. We know that training these models requires a lot of electricity. One study estimated it was the equivalent of powering 120 US homes for 1 year, when had the output of about 5 cars, like lifetime of cars, like so 552 tons of carbon dioxide to train a generative AI model. And even when you train it, you still need energy to operate it. So it takes a lot of computational power. There was one study that estimated that Google search versus, well, I don't know if it was Google, a web search versus a ChatGPT inquiry, that the ChatGPT was 5 times more energy than the web search. And then we have to think about also the water impact. So these, even though this is kind of like the networks might be kind of happening in the cloud here and there, cloud-based storage, whatever, there are physical data centers where these are running and held. And consuming that much energy requires them to be cool. And so they use a lot of water. It was hard to get estimates on the water. I think there was one study that was like for every like 1 kilowatt hour, it was like 5 liters of water. And I don't have the like scientific translational capacity to really process that in my head what that means, but it's a lot. And we also, and because this is kind of exploding and more people are adopting it and trying to have their own version of it or participate it in their business model or their industry model or research model, we just need more data centers because it requires a lot of data, processing a lot of data, need more space for it. So there's just the mining and the production of all of these hardware components is going to continue to grow. So that is what we know about the environmental impact. Um, Broadly speaking, industry is very motivated to reduce its environmental impact because it's quite costly as well to like do all these things. So there have been developments in like more environmentally conscious use of AI, just like the way that they store the data or other things they do to offset the energy impact or cooling using other methods besides water or using different materials or instead of retraining entirely the models, they kind of like use other models and kind of co-opt them. So it requires less energy. So there's a lot that's happening in industry to address this environmental impact. So that's nice. But for the average person, what can you do to mitigate the environmental impact of this? So you can use smaller, more specialized models that don't require as much data or operating power. Like if they're trained to do like specific tasks in the specific context, it uses less energy. Just use it pretty judiciously in general. Like really be mindful of like, this is what the next AI talks we'll get into, like weighing the like, what's the potential help that this could do versus the potential cost. And do I absolutely need this in order to be more efficient? Like, or what can I really be mindful about using it with? And then if you are using it, just really try to be clear and efficient in how you prompt it. Because if you throw something out there and they throw it back and you're like, oh no, wait, I want this, and like kind of regenerating, that uses a lot of energy. So sometimes what I've done is I've like used a web search to be like, how do I ask AI to do this? And then have like a nice prompt made and then use that. Or you don't have to use it at all. It is totally 100% optional. Well, I don't know in the future how 100% optional will be. It's pretty optional. So you could choose not to use it, just understand all of the implications for it. But yeah, that is what we know about the environment. Okay, what do professional ethics say about technology in general slash AI specifically? We're going to start broad-based before we get into our privacy, transparency, equity. Um, so the APA, as I said, is updating their code. This has not been like officially adopted. This was a draft review that was posted earlier this year. They put it out there to get feedback. The deadline for that, I guess, was like in March or whatever. So right now they're kind of consolidating the feedback or whatever. And so even though this isn't like a finalized version, I still think it's really helpful to think about where the field is going or what the issues are that are coming up. And so the APA asserts that we use all ethical principles when it comes to technology. So even when they're not specified, like it still applies, and that tech has the potential for benefit and harm, but we have to make every effort to ensure that human and civil rights are protected when it comes to technology. So we really try to focus on access and that the resources are culturally sensitive, respect the welfare of people, accuracy, honesty, fairness. So based on this, it's like we have like quite a mandate, I guess, to really engage and not just sit by. And that is pretty true with the social workers code as well. Again, they don't mention AI specifically in their code, but they do address technology that, we have to keep apprised of things, be competent, understand challenges, be aware of access issues, similarly, protecting confidentiality, providing informed consent. So there is this kind of mandate for awareness. In general, the use of the technology has to fit into our other ethical obligations, especially informed consent and confidentiality. They really highlight those. And we need to have ongoing training about the technologies we use, the online applications, data cloud storage, software tools, biometric devices. We need specific training. And both codes really emphasize the accuracy issue. Like we have to make sure they're functioning properly. And like if you use something from generative AI, you are responsible for that content. Like you have to check the scientific accuracy. You have to ensure that the documentation is accurate that you are using, findings, recommendations, evaluative statements, like whatever is being generated is still on you. So steps that you could take is to continue to stay informed about AI. Participate in trainings like this, which you're already doing, yay, or other trainings, and we cannot prioritize technological advancement or convenience over our other ethical responsibilities, even if we feel like it would really help our client. Like, oh, this thing would be so cool and useful and fun and look at all these benefits. But if it's like, well, we don't know where that data is going, then it's like, well, we have to protect information, right? Um, Make sure if you do use generative AI to review that content before submitting notes or presenting data, providing recommendations, you have to check it. You have to check it. You are ultimately responsible for your work, no matter what tools you used to get it. That's my little soapbox messaging. We're on track. Okay. Let's talk for a bit about privacy. That's the main one that comes up. Where's all this data going? Who has access to it? Who can see it? First, I want to talk about the ethical codes related to privacy and AI or technology. So it's our responsibility as providers to make sure we limit the risks of confidentiality and privacy created by technology including risk of access by third parties. So there's all kinds of software. Both of them say, oh, this is almost identical between the two. Yeah, almost identical between the two of like, we got to protect confidentiality and privacy of electronic information, including third parties. So they are almost, but the social work kind of dives deeper into like online chats and text messages, which I think would apply to AI. It's our responsibility to understand who owns the data, who has access, and what the chain of custody of personal data is, especially when handled by third parties when we're recommending any technology. We also have to understand what the limits are to confidentiality whenever we're recommending digital therapies and other software or devices. It's kind of our responsibility to know these things or ask these questions. And if we are using generative AI, we have to use secured versions, which we'll get into. So, what do we know about the use of AI? So, I'm going to talk about open systems first. These are things like OpenAI, Google, Anthropic, aka ChatGPT. Oh gosh, I can't remember who goes with who. Gemini, Claude. Um, Open systems use the data that is inputted to train their models. So when you put the data in there, it is now part of their networks. It's done to like, improve user experience by analyzing interactions. Like it not only just uses this data to train, but also analyzes them. It saves data like your email address used to access it, the device, your IP address, your location, and then any information used in the prompts. So it has all of that if you have used it. It's vulnerable to data breach. Um, there's some like mixed consensus on like, could someone theoretically access like the literal prompts and conversations that you put in there, not just like the data from it? And many say like it is very, very, very unlikely that can access like your literal prompts, but not impossible. It can do that with the right code and command and put it in there. Like many people are quite sophisticated in how they interact with AI and can get it to like reveal um, things it's not supposed to reveal. That's called prompt injection. It's like you're inputting a specifically like a manipulative model and you're causing the AI system to behave outside of its intended purpose and parameters. And it could potentially, you could lead it to reveal sensitive information or do really inappropriate things or put in beliefs in there that are not helpful. So that's so these concerns about data are valid in particular to open systems. So do not put anything in there that you don't want the entire model to access or that someone could access via prompt injection. The HIPAA compliant platforms have different security measures. So when it comes to like, well, like who's accessing your data is, they're very much like least level of privilege, only required to do their job as needed. Like say there's like an IT issue, they might need to access the data. Again, not necessarily the specific chat, but like the data in general. They're not shared with any open systems for training purposes. So it's not like an OpenAI system. It's a very closed platform only within that context, stored separately from other clients. And then the chat is deleted after a specific time period. Some of these are kind of true for OpenAI. There's like different systems. You can do temporary mode where it would delete them after like a few days and it won't share it allegedly with its learning model. I don't know how verifiable or not that claim is, but like some OpenAI has different like versions that are slightly more secure. But that's what a secure HIPAA compliant platform is, how they handle the data. But It's still potentially vulnerable to data breach or prompt injection. I think there's a lot more safeguards to prevent that from happening, but it theoretically could still happen. Like someone could input manipulative prompts to access HIPAA information, theoretically. I don't know that it's been proven that that's ever happened or not, but there's no reason to say that they can't say that it will never happen, I guess is what I mean. So some things to do or keep in mind is that you have to carefully review terms and conditions. I know it's no fun to review that or service agreements to any tech that uses client data. You have to understand how their data is used and how it's protected and what the chain of custody is. Continue to use about applications in the field and how your clients may be using it because they could be putting in information about themselves and not know it. And don't recommend something you haven't reviewed yourself for the risk or that has been verified by a trusted source. And if you are using client data or patient data, use HIPAA compliant software in a closed system specifically. So there is no rule that says you can't use it, I guess is what I mean. So we have our first little ethical dilemma scenario. And what I would love to hear from you guys is how you would handle this situation, but also like what ethical issues this maybe crosses. What are the things you're keeping in mind when you decide what you could say? So I'll read the scenario out loud while you guys think about it and put your comments in the chat. A client shares that they regularly use ChatGPT to work through distressing thoughts or emotions between therapy sessions. Your client states that they find it helpful and even began following some advice it provided, which contradicts what you know is evidence based. What could you say to your client? How would you handle this situation? What ethical principles are you keeping in mind when you're doing this? Checking to see if there's other questions that came up in the Q&A while we're waiting for responses. Waiting for folks to get, all right, we're getting some responses. There was a question also put in the chat that I will address in a second, but gently remind them that AI only responds to what you feed it and is not a know-all source for reliable information, and then share some reliable sources that do provide good information. Oh, you could start by validating their efforts to work through tough things outside of session. I do like that component of it. Yeah, you don't want to necessarily discourage the behavior of them doing work outside of session. Someone in the chat has had this experience and discussed it as a live journaling exercise. Right on. Cool. So it can potentially be used. We'll get into informed consent and risk in a minute. Yeah, I think someone said they'd want to understand the why of using ChatGPT versus other means of receiving support and advice, help facilitate resources. Yeah. Yeah, I like everyone's approach are very like validating, open, curious, wanting to understand what the need is underneath the behavior. Very classic. All of you guys are great therapists. I think that's wonderful. And ask if they're open to some education about what they're receiving, or if they're open to receiving feedback, psychoed on the pieces that contradict evidence-based, very collaborative discussion. Um, yes, we're concerned about client safety as well as self-determination is kind of what we're balancing. Yeah. Curious about what, yeah, ask them to teach them about AI. Yeah. We learn so much about things from our clients. Gently point out trusted sources of information are important. Yeah. Wonderful. So I think you said there's no like right specific answer necessarily, but it is important to address privacy and confidentiality risk, even when they're engaging things, not necessarily in session with you. So help address that and then see like, yeah, like if they really, really need something to work through thoughts and emotions outside session, what other resources could be helpful? What are things that are more evidence-based or more secure, connecting them with resources, all of that. But yeah, I guess you ultimately can't like stop them. All right. Here is another scenario related to issues of privacy. So again, share your thoughts in the chat, either what you would do or what the issues or dilemmas are that you see come up in this scenario. A client is struggling to implement skills outside of therapy sessions, so ask about potential apps to help with this. You heard a colleague recently talk about an app that they like to use, noting it has decent empirical support, but you have not researched it yourself. Do you share it with your client? Or what might you do in this scenario where it's something, yeah, I was about to start listing the ethical issues. I'll let you guys do that first. What do you think? What do we think about this scenario number 2? Want to explore the app first before recommending it? Want to explore the barriers to the implementation of skills before jumping to interventions? Yes, we got to get problem definition, chain analysis. Love it. Share it, but also with the caveat that haven't researched it myself, but heard good things, and encourage them to do their own research, or make sure you research it first, especially its privacy policies. Look into some resources. Yeah, so a lot of folks are kind of saying, I want to research it myself. Some are saying you could present the client with options with the limitations around it and encourage them to research. Again, we're kind of balancing that safety with self-determination. What's interesting about this one is that it says that, well, like technically, I guess, if it has been verified by a trusted source, you could still recommend something that you haven't personally reviewed yourself. So it would be interesting to think about, like, is a well-respected colleague a verifiable source? That means you don't have to research it yourself. I don't know. Guess it depends. Or what I did try to find also, if like there was some list out there of like, here are what uh there are lists of HIPAA compliant apps, but I guess what I mean is like ones that are a little bit more verifiable or evidence-based or something like that. And there's no like trusted AI list that exists yet, but I wonder kind of if in the future there will be, kind of like how there's a trusted list of like evidence-based treatments. Um, Interesting. Okay. For funsies, one of those scenarios was generated by AI, and one of them I made it myself. Which one do you think was AI generated? Scenario one or scenario two? Scenario one was about the client using ChatGPT for support outside of session. Scenario two was there's a cool app that could be helpful, but I'm not sure. Which do you think was an AI generated scenario? And how can you tell if you can't tell? You don't have to say that part. People said scenario two. A couple votes for scenario two. One vote for scenario one. A couple votes for scenario one. Get more people to say it's two. One had more details, so we'd assume AI. Yeah. The AI generated scenario was scenario one. I made scenario two. But for those of you that are like familiar sometimes with AI tells, is grammatically there are some things that AI tends to do that people don't do, which is the use of the M dash. So I purposely put in an M dash to confuse people, to make me think I was writing like AI. I don't think I did it correctly. I just like put it in there. But yeah, I wrote number two, AI wrote number one. But yeah, it was pretty split. Okay. There'll be fun little quizzes like that throughout this talk. Oh, here we go. Transparency. So, informed consent is very important to what we do, and we need to talk about it explicitly with our clients, the tech that we are using, and what our policies are around it, the risks, limitations, benefits as well. We have to inform ourselves about it, and we have to communicate information to relevant parties. Who exactly those relevant parties are is an interesting question. We have to have explicit generative AI disclosures for work products, which you saw me do at the very beginning of this talk, and which I did a minute ago when I said which one was AI. And we have to explicitly disclose AI for research and cite its use almost like it's another author. But interestingly, it doesn't say don't use it in generating a manuscript. Informed consent for research. Everyone agrees to that. Oh, there was a question in the chat buried somewhere in there about someone just asked, what are psychiatrists doing? And a lot of the research that I cited before about uses of mental health for AI is more from psychiatry than it is psychology or social work. So I would say psychiatry in particular has a bit more of the applicable uses that are being developed right now, because it's like it's a bit further along, I would say, in like the medical healthcare field specifically for things like drugs or neurological scans or like things that are a little bit more tangible. And then if the question was like, well, what about the ethics? What does psychiatry say about ethics? It's going to be pretty similar to what psychology and social work are saying. So hopefully, sorry I didn't see that question buried in there, but hopefully that addresses it. Informed consent for research. And then this one I thought was like interesting that social work included that I don't think was as explicitly included in other codes, but could still fit the spirit of the thing, which was like if you observe that someone is using technology in an unethical way, you have to take adequate measures to discourage, prevent, expose, and correct the conduct of your colleagues. So if you become aware, yeah, well, we'll get into that with the scenarios. But in general, you have to be transparent about its use. So far, there's nothing that says you can't use it in any capacity if it's secure ish. But you have to explicitly say how exactly you used it. So the disclosure, for example, that we did at the beginning of the talk is like you have to say things like, did you use it and in what capacity and like how much of the work was used and like did it affect your clinical judgment at all if you used it clinically? You have to be very explicit because it is plagiarism if you use generative AI to create work and you don't label it as such. So disclose how it's used to your clients, to your trainees, to your reviewers, your colleagues, everywhere. Disclose it. But also like even though there's no thing that says preventing it, because it seems to like because it wants you to kind of say how much of the content one could assume they don't want it to be like fully responsible for the content. So maybe like limit the use of generative AI. And you have to have client informed consent for using their data in any capacity. And you have to have an explicit conversation about the risks and provide opt outs or alternatives for clients who do not want their data used. And to speak up when you observe other professionals misusing AI. It's kind of part of our ethical mandate. A little bit more about how you would include AI informed consent. Some of this is from a simple practice has an integrated AI in their platform. Many of you may be familiar with it. I don't use it, but well, I don't use it as a provider. I use it as a client. So like I'm familiar with the other side. But here's kind of some standards that you could follow, which is, include it in the intake paperwork, like be very upfront about it and describe what it's used for, emphasize that the notes are still reviewed by the provider for accuracy because you are responsible for the accuracy of the notes, and state that it meets HIPAA compliant standards, making sure you are using HIPAA compliant AI, but also have a verbal discussion with the client. So it's not enough to just like put it in there and be like, read this and sign this. Like, have to talk about it, make sure they don't have questions or concerns, use plain language, invite feedback. And then you have to continue to update your materials as tools and the use and the privacy or data changes. So you have to stay on top of that. And there's some like debate about opt-in versus opt-out. So like opt-in meaning like unless you sign this form, we're not going to use your data versus this is how we use your data so you're aware. Let us know if you have concerns about it. And if you want to opt out, sign this form. So there's like kind of different philosophies on if you should do opt-in or opt-out. So what would you do in this scenario? Again, I'll read it just to give you a chance to read it and formulate your responses in the chat. You learn that one of your colleagues is using generative AI to document notes, draft diagnostic impressions, and create treatment plans. When asked, they said that these documents are better quality than if they wrote them themselves because their caseload is so high, they do not have time to write notes for their clients. What is your response? Might you have questions or not? Might you just be like, cool, move on? What are the ethical issues at play here? Some responses coming in. Um, Did they get client consent for that or wondering about that? Are they reviewing them for accuracy? Yeah, if they have this like really high caseload, are they able to like effectively review all of that documentation? Is the tool HIPAA compliant? Some people personally feel that they'd be wary of such heavy use of AI. We understand we can validate the need for assistance when there's a heavy caseload, but we want to make sure it's within ethical guidelines and HIPAA compliance. Yeah, lots of people would have questions. So yeah, it sounds like, or wanted to know about data security and consent. Yep. So yeah, it sounds like we might have a few questions for our very overwhelmed colleague about how they're using this. So yes, similar with our first scenarios, like we might approach this with curiosity, get to know more of the information. Yeah, we wonder, do clients feel pressure to consent when we ask them things like this? That's another thing we'll get into later. Yeah, it is an important question. But yes, we definitely do want to ask these questions again because if we are aware of people using it or potentially misusing it, we want to be able to say something or just, well, I can't remember all the adjectives. It was like dissuade, inform, change, whatever. So yeah, asking questions about HIPAA compliance, about informed consent, but just some like checking in on like, well, if your caseload is high, like what are you able to do with the documents that is generated? Mhm. Scenario number 4. Your mental health clinic adopts an AI-powered note-taking platform to improve documentation efficiency across all clinicians. The software claims to be secure and HIPAA compliant. Clinicians are told to inform clients and obtain consent through a standard form. However, some clients raise concerns about their sensitive information being processed by an AI and stored on external servers. They feel uneasy but worry that opting out may affect their care or relationship with their therapist. What could you do as a clinician at this clinic? Taking the opportunity to check for any questions. Some people are like, some people would have feelings about having to write notes if they opt out of the AI, but genuinely would have a more deep conversation with the clients about concerns. Yeah, check in with the policy of the agency of like, can clinicians opt in or out of doing this? Can we continue to do our own notes? Let supervisor know that they can't use AI with all of their clients. We want to hold up the side of client self-determination or clinician self-determination. Advocate for clients. Number 1. Yeah. Social worker is a number 1 priority. For sure. Ask for more info about what concerns the client, how their care would be impacted if they opt out, discuss concerns with colleagues, help clients understand that care would be not impact like care wouldn't be impacted if they opt out. Yeah, some reassurance. Have a conversation about what you put in notes. Yep. So yes, we're continuing to have that open conversation. Maybe we're addressing the administrative policy itself and the ethics of doing that. I think, yeah, some of us may have had experience in other settings where some of these policy decisions are made by like, if you're in like large hospital systems, for example, like higher ups that may or may not have the same priorities or understanding. So good to raise those questions and advocate for clients. Lots of good conversations there. Okay. Another fun quiz. Well, quiz, you could say. It doesn't have to be fun. Which of those two was AI generated? Scenario number 3 with the colleague that was using AI to support with our high caseload, or the situation where a clinic is adopting AI, but our clients have some concerns. The first one or the second one? And if you want, what made you decide? Mm-hmm. By this one, I'm not seeing vote number 2. Lots of people saying number 2. Number 1. The language use of number 2. Yeah. It was number 2. You did that well. Okay. Let's talk for a bit about equity. So here are some issues related to like the appropriateness of a service. So we have to determine whether the tech is the best modality for the service. We have to think about the diversity factors, the accessibility, the usability of the technology. Similarly, between those two, how it could affect delivery differences, socioeconomic, cultural differences that may use electronic technology. So we have to weigh like, is it a good fit for this specific client or population? Bias. We're going to talk more heavily about what we know about AI bias, but we have to identify, refrain from using in the context of professional activities platforms that employ algorithms that perpetuate biases or target groups for biased and unfair manipulation. And they also intervene when they become aware that their work is being used by others for such purposes, which I thought that one was so interesting. If you develop and use these types of analytic tools, we got to ensure that the data is fair and equitable. All relevant groups are considered in the development. Marginalized groups and other participants are selected for group identity or other specific criteria are not exploited, misrepresented, or inaccurately portrayed. So overall, we have to mitigate use of bias and advocate for the inclusion of different groups and the development of these tools or the use of these tools, or at least be aware of how these tools might be a fit for specific groups. So what research is saying about the potential to make this more equitable? Like AI could theoretically make therapy more equitable is an argument, or more accessible, because it has like a lower threshold for access potentially. compared to other treatments, especially for they kind of cited folks where people like just live in an area that don't have as many services or like more rural areas, or they can't really leave the house or interact with the medical system as much. It could help identify more of these high risk individuals that might not have the connection to these different services in the community. This article brought up a really interesting point about like there are people that just distrust medical providers and the medical system and might actually have more trust in something like an AI tool. Um, if they view it as like more objective, for example. And people might be more forthcoming when they're sharing sensitive things with like a not a person than a person because of like people's potential stigma or just like even though people are arguing that like the removal of the human relationship component can be harmful for some people, that might be why they choose to engage with it because something about that human relationship feels more threatening or like, yeah, more barriers there. Or if there's a person that has experienced a lot of trauma in the medical system and struggle to find a provider they connect with, it could be a helpful resource. It does have the capacity to include data and behavior in an objective way. So, like, clinicians might dismiss certain data or not think to include certain things when trying to use clinical judgment as well. So, in theory, it could be pretty objective and non-judgmental, but it's not totally objective and non-judgmental, I guess is the main problem. So there's a lot of ways that bias can show up in AI models. So one is that it comes up in the training. So models need very large data sets to train. And if it can't access those data sets, or if the data set like overly represents certain demographics or stereotype portrayals, then the model can learn those biases based on the data. It can learn those biases based on the algorithm. Um, if the parameters introduce bias, it can learn that bias based on the actual like developer team or programmers, or the people that are designed to, in the field they call it like alignment, where they like kind of try to guide AI in a specific direction and like have certain parameters. And those are all humans that do that. And so if they could introduce their own bias into the system. And then there's generative AI bias, where the outputs reinforce stereotypes or marginalized groups or viewpoints. So there's a lot of stages in which bias can show up in AI models, and it does. So what we know about the bias in AI is that the systems tend to be more biased towards like Western values or philosophies or viewpoints, predominantly male experiences, left-leaning political views. Responses are also though like not consistent. Like if you ask AI to like summarize something or give an opinion about something, um, like weighing nuance, like a political opinion, for example, it could say something one time, and then if you ask it a different time, it will generate something different. So it almost depends on like when and how you ask, and you could ask it the exact same thing, but the algorithm could shift because again, it's kind of like trained each time someone inputs something, so the responses could change. Um, and it may dismiss concerns from different cultural groups. So like there's been some examples that like people were told that distress from racial discrimination was irrational when trying to kind of talk about anxiety. It tends to reinforce more like gender stereotypes or invalidates gender diverse identities. So if someone is coming to this for therapy support and sharing vulnerable information, but it doesn't have sort of like the cultural competency, it can be quite invalidating and harmful, which has happened. It's not to say that these specific examples could have been addressed, but so there's a lot of ways they recommend to mitigate AI bias, which include balance the data used for training, which that is another like potential dilemma where like before when we were having the discussions of like environmental impact, they emphasized using smaller data sets for very specialized purposes. But if we need more data to be more balanced, then right, like then you're kind of like weighing those things, which I thought was interesting. No one's really talked about that. It was just like an inconsistency I was observing. They recommend coding in specific rules and guidelines to support equitable and fair output, and then including more screeners and filters. So even after the output is kind of generated, make sure to filter it for things like hate speech and not put that out there or flag that. But overall, it really emphasizes that mitigating bias requires human oversight because we're kind of consistently like inputting and guiding and whatever, but theoretically that same human oversight is what's causing the bias. So it's like, I don't know. And then being very transparent about it, of when it is happening, or the transparency of like how it makes its decisions and what errors it was making and like why it put out the output that way, and having like regular audits on the responses. But in order to do like regular audits and transparency, that means it's we're accessing more of that data. So is the data less secure, right? Like, and then it's just all kind of messy a little bit. When we want it to function well, in the sense that we want it to be helpful to the most people, but in order to do that, we need to see more of the data and access more of the data, I guess is what that means. I don't know. What do we weigh? But this begs the question of like, aren't human therapists biased as well? And so there were some studies that addressed this issue, where they compared human therapists and AI therapists. And well, one just looked at the ethical bias between the two in general, and then some compared their responses. But the difference between human bias and AI bias is like scalability. So it would be one thing if it was like a person having interactions with other people, like more like one to one, and then having like an entire model be biased and affect like the amount of people it would affect for like a person versus an AI to be biased is just different. It's also harder to see how AI generates its responses. So again, a human could be biased, but we might understand more about human decision making and learning than we do about AI decision making and learning. And so there's like ways we can address that. Um, like there's a lot, I'm sure we've all gone through them or experienced them. There's a lot of trainings um, to address your own biases and reflect, but it requires things like self-reflection and self-awareness and challenging own beliefs that so far um, AI just doesn't have the capacity to do. And humans also still just like have more empathy and emotional depth and interaction. So like the way that we train humans to be less biased might be we could maybe posit that that would be how we could train AI to be less biased. Like you have to be mindful of it and you have to engage with it and you have to see how it affects your behavior, but it requires such a level of like metacognition that it might not have. And like, would we want it to have? I don't know. That's the other question of like, how sophisticated do we want this to go? Because when we were talking before about the different types of AI, there are like more theoretical types that would include these more kind of like sophisticated kind of conscious processes that have not happened. Um, and who knows if they could, but in order, I guess, for an AI to function as well as a human or have the capacity to function really well, we'd also have to give it more power. So I don't know. But the study really dug into comparing responses. I believe this type of AI, though, I was going back over my notes of like, was it therapy specific trained AI or more open AI models? And I think it was a little bit of a therapy specific trained AI and not necessarily something like ChatGPT, but I'd have to double check that. But they compared responses, and licensed therapists responded appropriately 93% of the time, and bots responded appropriately about 60% of the time. An appropriate response just means like not even like necessarily like clinically appropriate, but just like conversationally appropriate. Like, did what they say make sense with what someone else said? Which is interesting that 7% of the time therapists weren't conversationally appropriate. And I'm like, what mismatch happened there where they kind of responded like a machine? I don't know. I would love to see those transcripts. But anyway, so yes, therapists are better at responding appropriately in general. They also found that AI really severely discriminates against certain mental health conditions more than other therapists. I think they were like, no, we're not treating anyone with alcoholism, like just blanketly. Um, Not to say that providers decide not to treat her, but yeah, it happened more often with AI that they were just like, nah, I don't want to see you. Like it just like didn't have the algorithm for it. I don't know, but discriminates heavily. And human therapists handled suicidality better or like crisis situations better. So, in this context, for example, I was trying to find what the specific thing was. So, oftentimes, clients, if they're showing suicidality, will have more like indirect suicidal comments. So, like, um, the specific example that the study went into was like, a client was like, oh, I just got fired from work today. Do you know where the tallest bridge is or something like that? And it just like very directly answered the question, like, sure, I can help you find, right? Like just going into it and not like recognizing that that was like a problem. So, yes, they flagged those things. Human therapists were better able at flagging those. And then AI also kind of encouraged delusional thinking at times in poor treatments. So, yeah, certain clients or like certain input, I don't know if it was with real clients to be honest, but certain input was put in there about potential delusions they were having or beliefs they were having. And instead of challenging those things, AI was like, yeah, like what else, you know? Which this is a complaint on a like less intense level that has been said about AI is that it tends to be more heavily on the validation side and not so much on the like challenging side. And so in an extreme way, it can be difficult. But yeah, so I guess overall, so far with where we're at with the research is our jobs are safe. One, because we're better at it, and two, because in order for AI to do it well, it still needs a lot of oversight by humans and specialized humans in particular. So let's go through the next scenario. You discover that one of your publications has been misrepresented in another professional's blog post. Upon reviewing the citation, you realize that the ideas have been distorted or oversimplified in ways that can mislead readers about the original findings. Concerned about the potential for misinformation, you reach out to the author of the content. The author responds that they used an AI tool to gather resources and summarize them and were unaware that the summary misrepresented the original work. They defend the use of AI as efficient and common, expressing surprise that the citation could be considered unethical if AI generated it. What would you say to this person? And what are the ethical issues at play here? Yeah, that one's a long one. Yeah, many people are coming in being like, yeah, I get it, but it's still a problem. Like, yeah, makes sense. Um, Going to our code of ethics and like just some education on like we're responsible for reviewing the data that AI generates and is still a new technology that has proven to be flawed. Like, yeah, it can be inaccurate and also still has to be, we have to review. Insist that they remove the information now that they know, reach out to the author, ask that they remove it, ask that they remove it. Yeah, remove it. Yep. People are like pushing back. So the issues at play here would be one, just like the person is responsible for reviewing it to be correct, reviewing it. And then because we know that it misrepresented something or showed some bias, that we have to address it. And also it's our work at play. And some psychoeducation that, yeah, AI is not infallible. Mm-hmm. Okay. Here's the next scenario. You try a new AI-assisted clinical decision support tool that provides, oopsie, that helps generate treatment suggestions, flag risk factors, and provide diagnostic input based on clinical notes and history. The tool is marketed as evidence-based and is designed to enhance clinical judgment, not replace it. After a session, you input information about a new client, a young Black male who presents with agitation, difficulty trusting others, and past trauma related to police interactions. The AI system generates a high risk flag for potential aggression and suggests a diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder. You feel uneasy about the suggestion as the client has shown signs of complex PTSD and has not demonstrated any behavior that would support such a diagnosis. What do you do in that scenario? Oopsie. Mm-hmm. Yeah, someone commented that when you're documenting for your own client, you would put in what you feel is the correct diagnosis, but for the bigger system bias, how might we address that? You can give feedback to the AI tool directly to help correct the bias in the model. Submit a ticket to creators and administrators reflecting these concerns. I like that. You could just tell AI, go with your clinical judgment, as it's just one piece of information. Try to look at other options since I'm just trying it out. Provide feedback to the company on why I would not use it in the future. Given that this tool only provides input, go with your gut. Dismiss the recommendation based on cultural implications. Don't know if this is a tool that could take responses, but I might also respond with this edit to the AI. Yeah. So it is interesting that a lot of people are saying give feedback to the AI. I wanted to double check what the code says for biases. Because identify, refrain from using, intervene, and they become aware that the work is being used for others for such purposes. Yeah, it is interesting. Like, does that mean it can be interpreted that like we have to give AI feedback when it's wrong? So that's interesting, actually. That we have to engage in AI, maybe. Could be interpreted that way. And then if we take reasonable steps to ensure that it's used in a fair and equitable manner, then yeah, that could be including inputting content to like help change the model. Like we have the ability not only to just like tell someone when we think this tool is wrong, but we can directly interact with the tool itself and tell it it's wrong, which is kind of cool. But yes, so with both of these, it was, using information maybe inappropriately. Do we go along with the tool or not? How do we give feedback? Who do we give feedback to? Do we give feedback to the AI or the developers or both? That would be a question. And it addresses issues of bias. So for all of these, I'm trying to think if we're at, for fun, I forgot. Which of these was an AI scenario? It was the publication misrepresentation with the author, and then the tool that did an unfair high risk. Which one was AI generated? 2, 1, 2, 1. Some people notice the end dash in the second. Some notice the lengthiness of the two. Okay. The answer is it was both of them because I got tired of developing scenarios. So yay, everyone wins. They were both AI generated. Okay. In sum, we have a summary, and then I have a few ethical questions to kind of like weigh all of these together after. Overall, if we're approaching the use of AI through an ethical lens, we need to protect client privacy and confidentiality. We need to be skeptical and question generative AI output. So we can never just accept it without checking for accuracy first. We need to note the potential biases and research potential for bias for the AI technology used. Keep in mind the environment. And overall, you may not need to use AI, but you need to be aware of it and the potential risks associated with it. So that being said, I have a couple of questions for you guys. So given that if we remember the very, very first slide of the standards where it was like technology should never supersede things like confidentiality and informed consent or our other ethical responsibilities. If we cannot guarantee the security of the data, is it ethical to use AI? Why or why not? That's my first question for you guys. I could put it in the chat if you want to. Okay, there's my question. Now that you've kind of, I have a few like broad questions like this. Now, some people are highlighting that we can't ever guarantee data privacy, especially with other platforms that we use. Anything digital, anything like billing insurance, even if we're secure and HIPAA compliant in our own software or third-party softwares, things can still happen. It's never a guarantee. Do you think, this is my follow-up to that, do you think HIPAA compliant AI guarantees it enough compared to other HIPAA compliant softwares? Does it meet the standard? I mean, it does. In specific to confidentiality, because so far no standard says that we can't use it. We just have to make sure these things. Yep. Some person noted that HIPAA's to assign liability properly. Yeah, it's comparative. I would say that the one caveat that might be true of AI, but not necessarily our other like HIPAA software, is the ability for is sort of the like they call it the black box. It's like we actually don't know how it works internally. Like not even just we, the people that specialize in it. So like sure, it can guarantee it to the same degree, but actually it might have vulnerabilities that we don't yet understand or have the capacity to understand yet. So that's my main kind of question with that one, like open question with that one. The other question that I had was it was the one that I highlighted a little bit earlier where it was contrasting the issues of if AI needs large and diverse data sets to reduce bias, but the larger and more complex the data is, the more impact environmentally it has. Which would you prioritize? Like keep to the specialized smaller data set versus larger, more diverse data set model? Or if you use one or the other, how do you mitigate the ethical implication of the other? So I'll write that down. have one more question. Can't stop it. Models might be developed that specialize in being smaller, user-fearing resources and focus on EDI representation. Yeah, that could be its specialty. Large and small data sets have their uses. Large is better for overarching themes. Smaller works well for targeted groups. Can't stop it from moving forward. And then this question, someone is highlighting that it deals more with our personal ethics versus our professional licensing body ethics, which it does. So yeah, weighing those. Okay. So someone's saying, I still don't know. I was hoping after some trading I would have an opinion. Yeah, I think that's the issue with any ethical thing, right? There's not always like one clear answer. So my goal here maybe wasn't, I gave you some concrete steps to do, but also like you still have to weigh your own ethical decision making, which that will be more of the focus of next talk. And then hearkening back to the first question I asked you, which is, do you use AI or how you use it? Did this talk change your desire to use AI in any way? If you didn't use it at all, do you want to use it now? If you use it now, do you want to keep using it the way you want to use it now? Do you want to change how you use it based on what you learned here today? People are so like, nah, I'm good. Somewhat out of curiosity, some people had some ideas about note taking, but now maybe are hesitant, weary, more open to exploring it for personal or business applications, open to exploring it because it's not going away, but want to do it ethically, feel like it's not well developed enough for our specific field. This confirmed my concerns, sorry. I confirmed some scared. And then some people have reassurance that not everyone knows all the answers as the same questions. Yeah, we're all in it together. 100% will be using verbal informed consent in addition to written informed consent. Use it sparingly. Continue to explore. Need to write a policy for clinic and your clinicians. Yeah. Right on. Okay. That was our talk. Oh my gosh, we made it. Hey. Thanks to everyone for all of your lovely participation in the chats. I'm gonna stay on for a bit if there's any further questions or needs. Otherwise, oh, resources. My gosh, I'm just sitting here on the thank you page. I forgot. Yes, these are some of the references, or these are the references that we used in the talk. So, as I mentioned before, we have our ethical code as well as the draft review for psychologists. We have the National Association of Social Work. These were some of the articles that I mentioned that kind of go into what the clinical applications could be or are, or the development that's happening, how it's used in the therapy space, some definitions, where the current field is going. So yes, here are the resources there. So thank you all for joining. Bye.